Good afternoon, everyone. We are planning on having a very interactive session today, and hopefully we would ask that you save all your questions until the end. But I'm just going to give you a slight introduction of our panelists today. Virginia, as you know, she is an international attorney. She opened up her own she's a solo practitioner, and she's practiced at in-house counsel for a multinational company in Italy and Belgium. And she will be speaking first, and then after that, Stephen will be speaking, and he is the general counsel at Crown Clark and Whitehill. And prior to that, he used to write a lot of risk management articles. He worked for an investment bank, and also he worked in stopping traders from misconduct. And we talked about risk management and so forth, the head of conduct for risk management. So after Virginia will be Stephen, and we'll ask whole questions until the end. Thank you.
Okay. Better? Okay. Oh, do you prefer there?
You prefer standing? Okay.
Sorry. Okay. No problem. We were just deciding. No problem.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you for letting us know.
So, good afternoon, everybody. And I know we have a very tough task because we are after lunch and we're also the last session of today. So we're going to try to make it more interactive. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then Stephen is going to continue, and then we're going to open up the floor for any question. And really, not only just question, but your thoughts, your ideas, anything you think differently from our standpoint will be definitely appreciated. So what I'm going to talk about, as you see from the title, I wanted to make a journey in a very short period of time from Aristotle to the present. Well, what we're going to do, I decided to take a step back and see what was actually the root of what we are talking right now. We're talking about rhetoric, we're talking about persuasion, we're talking about a lot of stuff. But when and where it all started, I decided to go back and start a little bit by talking of words that we all know, but maybe we don't know how they started to be implemented in the meaning that we know today. So, ethos, logos, and pathos are three Greek words. Three words that have been translated very differently in the different time of the ages. Basically, they have also changed it slightly from the translator. So you may have different translation in English, and you may have very different translation from one language to another. So the concept of ethos, logos, and pathos may be different. So when you talk with a colleague from another part of the world, you need to be very careful on what you think they're thinking about that word, because there might be some misunderstanding. We are focusing on Aristotle today, so we're talking about a guy who lived many, many years ago and who wrote what I consider one of the most interesting book, that is the Rhetoric, the book that is the one we're talking for, Ethos, Logos, and Pathos. And he started writing this book 330, if I'm not mistaken, 330 before Christ, 335 before Christ. And it took him a long time to write this three-part book, the Rhetorics. And why do we want to focus on this three-part? Because in my view, when we start understanding really what was the meaning, what is the meaning, the root of this three word, and how can be applied really to what we do, we can really understand that something that can be considered variation, very old, not really so important for us, for lawyers, is instead very, very useful and interesting. Aristotle was speaking about these three models of persuasion, ethos, logos, and pathos, depending also on the perception and the person who was looking at the rhetoric. So if we start with ethos, ethos from Greek can be defined basically as the way of living, a way of living basically the place to live, how life should be lived, if we can use this word. Basically, ethos has the same roots of course, ethikos. It's another Greek word from which we know the word ethics in English. What was that meaning? Basically, it was the idea that the persuasion of the person who was speaking, the speaker, was a lot based on the way in which this person was able to live, the standard the person was living. So the idea was that the more the person, the speaker, was credible, the more he could pass along a message that was credible. There were a lot of discussion around this ethics and ethos, the word that started all from, because Aristotle actually didn't think that what was important was the life that the speaker lived up to the moment in which he was doing his rhetoric speech, but the way in which he was able to live in that moment. So the ethic of the moment of the speech, not what he or she have done before that. So there was kind of some question, and if you look back at different philosophers in different ages, they all had different opinion. We cannot find somebody who agreed completely, but we can at least set one point. Ethos was the starting point, the standing point of the speaker in the eyes of the other person, the eye of the listener, based on his moral, his conduct, his way of living. This is also really where ethics and all the similar words are coming from. And then we have the logos. Logos is, again, coming, of course, from Greek logo, and literally it's related with the speech, the thoughts, everything that is logic. Logic, it's a word that comes from logos, of course, and has to do with the ability of the speaker to present logical information, arguments, and being able to address the concern of the receiver, of the person who listens, in a logical way, in a way that has to do with clear and factual elements. So this is a key part. Logos having to do with the rational part and having to do with the analyzing factual. And then we have the third part, that is pathos. Again, under Greek word, paskin was also defined. And literally, pathos means either suffering or feeling emotion, something that has to do with emotion, but not the emotion of the speaker, while the emotion that the speaker can transmit to the listener, to the person who was listening. Therefore, why was important the pathos? The pathos was very important because a great speaker needed to increase the level of pathos felt by the listener, the person who was listening. So basically, there were a lot of critics against the pathos because somebody was considering something kind of like mystical, something that has to do not with logic, of course, because was not the logical part, but then had to do more with the divine, something that was not controllable, and therefore had a lot of critics, but was an important part, according to Aristotle, for the theory of the rhetoric. As a matter of fact, what was his idea? And I think that was brilliant because in my view, and not only in my view, but Aristotle was the first communicator in the world. Now we all talk about communication and how to become more effective in our communication and in our job, how to be a better communicator when we negotiate, how to be able to avoid maybe litigation by communicating in a better way. But in my view, it all started many, many years ago with him. Because when he started talking about rhetoric, it was not defining just some means of persuasion, but he wanted to really give to these three pieces, ethos, logos, and pathos, something more, something to study. So what he was saying was not just, okay, you need to have these three pieces together in some way, but you cannot forget that without one of the three pieces, your speech, if you're, for example, in a hearing in court, or your negotiation, if you're negotiating with somebody, will be defective of some point, will be lacking of some point. So what was this rhetoric? It was something more than simply saying, okay, those are three means of persuasion, but it was his idea and his way to study as a set of information that was going to give you an increase in result, a much better result in your communication level, and most of all, not just in politics, because we think about Aristotle and a lot of other philosophers, Greek or Romans, as people who talk about something that was good for them, was good for politicians, but is not really applicable to other fields. And in my view, this is not true, because, especially in the concept of Aristotle, this is really applicable in every profession. And I would like to add that, in my view, in our profession, is even more applicable than in other fields, because sometimes we forget that without one of the three parts that we saw before, our speech is a little bit short of information, either because we're not able to communicate. We may have the best logos, the best reasoning and thinking, the best facts, the best information, but not being able to communicate it to the other part will be just very brilliant, but we're not going to be able to demonstrate it or to conduct a negotiation in an effective way. Vice versa, we may be very good at finding a good, let's say, pathos feeling, a pathos kind of like agreement with the other part. We're able to make the listener understand our position, but we may not have facts to base on that. And our pathos part will definitely dissolve very soon. And finally, also for the ethos part, if somebody is not credible, in our case, somebody is not credible as a lawyer because he was not able to actually be distinguished for moral, for his background, for many things, would be very difficult during a negotiation, or in a case of an argument, in a case of a hearing, in a case of handling a litigation, so where we are in the pathological phase, we're not in negotiation anymore, the credibility of a lawyer will be very important. So therefore, in my view, all these three needs to be rediscovered, and in my view, we should not be so sure that something that was written so many years ago, it's not applicable just because it's superseded by other theory or by other ideas that are more modern. Because in my view, the majority of ideas, the majority of things that we are learning about how to negotiate, how to communicate, how to pass along a message that is effective, are coming from these roots. And therefore, if we sometimes take a moment to really go and rediscover in our life, in our daily operation, in our negotiation with our counterparts, in our litigation, if we go down and we try to discover which one of the three parts is, for example, the one we are lacking a little bit, and we work on improve that part, we can definitely become the best version of ourselves from a, again, negotiation or litigation point of view. I believe that too often we try to see a new instrument and we try to reinvent the wheel, where we should just go back and start looking from the roots, from the origin of something that we have, it's in our disposition, and we can learn from. In my view, is totally still applicable. And of course, I'm going to be very happy to hear your thoughts and have a conversation on that. I would like just to finish with a couple of practical example of what I think is very important in persuasion techniques, but also in negotiation first, because when we are in the pathological phase, it's slightly different. But in the negotiation phase, we often come with the idea that if I win, you need to lose, and therefore it needs to be a win-lose situation. Why? Well, often because we are taught this way in different ways, civil law or common law countries, law school, but oftentimes we were taught that if we are negotiating, we want to be right. We want to, of course, do the best for our client. We want to achieve our results. So what's important is that we win. And if we win, automatically, the counterpart will lose. With this attitude in mind, often we forget to think that sometimes, in my view, more than sometimes, we can have a win-win situation. And what we do is that we don't go into the matter with the mindset that may let us see the win-win situation, because we start by thinking, okay, in this situation, I can do whatever I want. I can, use all my my negotiation skills, and I will make sure that I win, but they need to lose everything. The important thing is not what's the end result for both. The important thing is the end result for me, for my client. That from one perspective, it's totally normal, totally right. We are defending our client, not the counterpart. But sometimes give us a different perspective that is totally limited, and we try to look at only one angle. From only one angle, we should move and consider things from a different perspective in order to make sure that we may find the win-win situation. I'm not saying it's always possible, but oftentimes we are not even looking at one because we don't have the mindset to do that. We are not trained to do that. And when we do, sometimes we find total different things. It's like that we step back and we see a room, a place from a total different perspective. Sometimes we see things that we didn't even think were there. So in my view, what can we learn from Aristotle rhetorics and the three parts of it that we saw, the three models that he incorporated? First of all, to change our mindset, and to try to look from another angle and try to really find the win-win situation whenever is possible. Because a lot of time when we want to go for a win-lose situation, we end up with a lose-lose situation. But we don't know it at the beginning. We just think that we're just doing the best for our client, but we are a little bit narrow-minded. We don't want to see. Sometimes it's for many reasons. But one thing is just changing the perspective. The second thing, in my view, the second practical example and second tips is to always be setting the higher level for the logos part, but also for the ethos part. What that means is we can always improve our knowledge by continue learning with humility. The humility that a lot of time we as lawyers don't have because, again, I think we were taught to be, strong and defend our cases, and that's perfectly fine. But sometimes, without the humility to go and learn and search more and go more in depth, also to understand sometimes why the counterpart is asking certain things, would make us even better lawyers and in a different position from a logos perspective. So, in my view, always go on content, be very strong on content, but with the humility to take what can be useful from the other side. And one practical tip that I would like to share with you is really always asking yourself the question that your worst enemy would ask you. This is something that in my practice I have found very, very useful. Don't limit the question, but continue asking question in order to find different answer and putting yourself in the other shoes by asking the question and you don't want to answer. Because if you start finding the answers for that type of question, you really are increasing all the 3 levels. And finally, how to increase your pathos ability a little bit. It's definitely something that you have inside, the ability to create the feeling with the other people, but we can also do something. We can definitely do something in order to make that step towards the other person, make the step in order to create the, basically, the connection with the other person. And this can change the way in which the same message is transferred. Remember what we said before, great content, great ethics, but very weak pathos may vary and may really go lower your negotiation, especially if we want to avoid the litigation. And in a case where we're reading the litigation, may have an impact on how we decide to settle, if we're able to settle, or how we decide to move forward. So this is what I wanted to say. If there's going to be a few minutes more after, maybe I'll share with you a story, but before I want to give the floor to Stephen. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Can a lawyer work the technology? So my name's Stephen Adsett. I've structured this, and I'll be quite brief, and I also have a video, along the same sort of model. And as we've been talking about here, my particular interest is persuading people to change behavior, but in a large scale. So although I am a litigator by background, my role has morphed over time, both within accountancy fields, in investment banking, into persuading large numbers of people to change their behavior. And what I've been trying to do is to reduce the likelihood of litigation. Now, it doesn't make me necessarily quite popular here, but as Deputy General Counsel at Deloitte and General Counsel now at Crowe, that's what I've been trying to do, is to reduce the chance of litigation, which allows me broadly more time to do other things and reduces our overall cost. And I'll structure it along these sorts of lines. Litigation is sometimes described as unpredictable, unpreventable. I've heard it continuing the metaphor described as the tectonic plate of misfortune meeting the tectonic plate of incompetence. I want to drill into that a little bit. The risk manager in me wants to seek to find patterns and reduce the likelihood of claim, or if that isn't possible, reduce the damaging stuff that is within litigation that we've all had to deal with at different times within disclosure. So following the structure with the ethos first, establishing my own credibility. So I've had a mixed career in terms of litigation, risk, compliance. Crowe is the 8th largest accountancy firm in the world. We have large numbers of people. And the model of this is trying to persuade large numbers of people to stop doing silly things. I'll start with the logos first. I think of this sort of crudely as left brain. So in the context of issues that I've had to deal with over the years, and in my world, and say the accountancy world, this tends to be kind of failures of logic, will be breaches of procedure, breaches of policy, bad tax planning, negligent audits. It's that type of thing. And to reduce the likelihood of error, then you or teams that you have, people within your organizations will be doing varieties of different things, recognizing that when you're preparing policies, that perhaps the only people that read them are the people that actually wrote them in the first place, and the regulator when they come to have a look at them. So we need to have other things as well. The guidance, support structures, you might have hotlines within your organizations. You might have people that are described as champions for particular aspects of compliance. You'll provide training. Typically, if you're getting out a message to large numbers of people, it's moved to e-learning training, and that kind of death by 1,000 clicks. I'll cover that and perhaps alternatives to doing that. Then you'll internally audit things. You'll use the stick. You'll use means for the kind of pour encourager les autres. You will discipline people where they are breaching policies. All of these are looking at these sort of failures of logic, these kind of left brain failures. In my experience, these aren't typically the things that lead to litigation, though. They might lead to an issue with a client. It might lead you to a loss. Again, in my world, in a tax world, you might make a mistake in relation to a piece of tax work. If the only failure is a failure of logic, with the other things being dealt with, the communication aspect being dealt with, then you can sort your way through that with the client. You might end up compensating them, but it doesn't usually get to the point where they've hired solicitors and brought litigation against you. The difference is here with Pathos, or what I kind of crudely describe as being right brain. This is the stuff that leads to claims. The absence of communication, poor communication. I work in a professional services environment, as will you in law firms. And it's the same within law firms. It's the same within the medical practice. An absence of empathy, recognizing that as lawyers we typically are empathy impaired. Not seeing the big picture, not stepping back, kind of relating it to my world in an audit context. That might be going through steps, checklist, verification steps, but not taking a step back and asking with professional skepticism why the company doesn't have the cash that it should do. The parallels with medical malpractice are quite interesting. There was a study done, in fact there were two studies, and the first one was done on hundreds of recorded conversations, and the conversations were with either doctors that had never been sued or doctors that had been sued at least twice. And there were distinct differences between the two different groups of people, and these were those. Doctors who hadn't been sued spent on average 3 minutes longer with their patients. And again, in my kind of professional services world, that's spending more time with your client. That reduces the likelihood of claim. More likely to involve in active listening. That's more about kind of being empathetic. Again, that reduces the likelihood of claim. And humour, more likely to laugh and be funny. There was a second study where they took the recorded conversations, they stripped out the content, however you're able to do that, and they just looked at everything else that goes within speech that's not content. And they had a bunch of Harvard researchers look at this, and they could predict, just based on this content-filtered conversations, which doctors fell in the claims camp and the no claims camp. And it came down to, basically, if you showed dominance, which again, relating it to, we're talking about doctors and surgeons who can fall into that category. In a professional services environment, you might be a tax partner that is has a poor response to a conflict and is saying, well, look, I'm the expert in this area when challenged by a client. And the other is an absence of empathy. The study then concluded, well, actually, it was written about in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, if you've read that. And Malcolm Gladwell summarizes it quite neatly by saying that patients don't sue doctors that they like. So what can we do? So one example, trying to get messages out is I distilled lessons from particular bits of litigation, and I put this out into my former firm, and it proved very popular. And then I've done other versions of it, looking at things like reducing unprofessional emails so that you don't have the disclosure issue within litigation. I've done things for the new data protection regulations, etc. This is one that I did some time ago. The risk management lesson to me, which is probably readily apparent, is don't be the first risk manager that the animators have met, and certainly don't do it during Movember when you're growing a moustache for charity. Otherwise, it might come back to bite you. Will this work? Should we abandon it? We can't hear the volume. I'm assuming that you can't hear at the back.
For now, and maybe he can figure it out later, and you can finish. I don't know how you. I'm gonna pause it and. Okay. That's pretty nice from here.
Yeah, you can hear it from here. So what I grandly describe at the beginning of this in terms of triggering the anterior cingulate cortex is known informally as the Oshit Circuit. And that's really what I've been trying to do through this and other methods, is trying to get messages out that are memorable to try and persuade people that they need to modulate their behavior. The death by 1,000 clicks email e-learning clearly doesn't work. So it's trying to get messages out there that are short, they're bite-sized, they address particular things and reduce the likelihood of litigation. And it's been reasonably successful. It's certainly been well received. If we have time, I was going to cover, because it's sort of the other, we're talking a broad topic in terms of negotiation, which is that when I've looked at, I was trained in mediation, in negotiation by the police hostage unit here, and they have a method of actively listening, and obviously in the context of a hostage scenario, you have to be actively listening because it is literally the difference between life and death. And I know that I'm absolutely terrible at actively listening. My body language says the exact opposite of what my words are saying. And the course that I went to certainly helped. And what they do, and the FBI apparently do it too.
1 second, Stephen. Do you want to try it?
We can play the video now.
Well, maybe we show it at the end. If you're utterly out of questions, then we'll threaten you with showing you the video. Is to go through this and to go through it in order. And I won't go through these here, but we can leave it on screen if people want to talk about it. And what this does, as well as actually making you listen to the other person in terms of reinforcing what they're saying back to you, paraphrasing, also gives the impression to that person that you are actively listening, which is certainly my fundamental problem. Just as an aside, I've been told that when I spend about once a month, I tend to mediate. And I know that I have a tendency, even while I'm exhibiting, I'm apologizing for something. I'm sorry, this is not our finest day in the office, but my body language will be sitting back at the time. And I have to consciously make an effort to lean forward in order to be able to convey the impression that I genuinely care. And it isn't just a banker's apology, which I was involved in training people to do. I will stop talking at this point because we've got running out of time, and sit back down and take some questions. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have any specific questions they would like to ask the panelists? Not everyone come at once. Okay, well, I have some questions. All right. I was taking notes while you were talking. In Virginia, I know in your presentation you talked about Aristotle saying live in the moment, which a lot of times we don't do. And I think it's important to kind of think about those types of things. Now, in your area of practice, in your experience and considering from a different perspective, how have you been able to implement this approach where both sides can be successful? I don't know if you want to. Okay.
Well, first of all, I recall in a couple of situations where I was trying in a negotiation with the counterpart from Switzerland, in that case. I was trying to prove my point. I was determined on what I was saying. And I was sure that the other part was not listening to me, was not even understanding what I was saying, but because they just wanted to show their client that, they, they were on the right side. Now, the issue was that they didn't understand the clause, but they, of course, didn't want to say it openly. Like, can we rephrase it in a way that actually we can understand in a better way? And especially because that was a technical issue where we went on discussing an article of the Civil Code in a specific way, and they were honestly ignorant on that part, but they didn't want to admit that. So I thought that they were just, playing tough because they wanted to keep that clause like that because they really felt that was fundamental for them. And we actually, in my view, we revised it in a way that was a win-win for both. So I didn't understand why they were so stubborn. And I asked a question in a way where I was able not to offend them, like, guys, you don't know what you're talking about. So, but I actually found a way to make sure that they felt comfortable in admitting that they were not actually arguing the value of the clause itself, but they were not able to understand it 100%. So they were not able to explain it to their client. So there was a situation like that where once I really tried to work on more on the Pathos side and also trying to change perspective and say, okay, but if I were them, why would I be so strong on this? Let me see what can be the possibilities. Either I don't understand, and one of the things was, okay, but really, if they didn't understand finally, the meaning, the full meaning, could it be that? And when we found a way of just simply, restating in a different way and having them understand the reason why we were saying that, and there was nothing, honestly, that could harm them, because we were getting really the win-win situation that was totally different. So,
Perfect. Thank you. And in dealing with that, I know you mentioned humility, and as attorneys, we're not trained necessarily to have that empathy or the humility for others. And again, that's a good point you made about our clients. We want to look the best in front of our clients. And so to kind of say we don't understand something doesn't look well or doesn't, come across very well for our clients. And I think sometimes we need to find a way to rephrase things, not to be offensive, because sometimes people are offended by the slightest things and you may not know that. So I think it's important to have that type of humility to approach it, but then also to step outside of it to look at it. Why is this person, why is he or she fighting me so much? And then you can figure out the experiences and how it changes the whole mediation, the whole, litigation and things of that nature. So that's very good. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
This is for Stephen, I think. I've been taking the underground here since I've been in London. And I think this morning I saw, or maybe it was last night, a PwC partner was just fired and forced to pay £500,000 or something. I think it was PwC who also paid a substantial amount for apparently really botching up an audit of a bankrupt company. How do you deal with your company to avoid such fiascos?
I don't know the detail of that. I mean, I read it too. There was a £10 million fine for PwC, and the partner concerned has been banned from practicing for 15 years. The regulatory landscape has changed for the profession. Really over the last 5-10 years, the fines have ratcheted up. There's been a lot of political pressure on the FRC, which is the regulator concerned here. It comes down, there's a number of different ways. It comes down to the quality of the work. So the people that are delivering the audit services, they need to be training people to be better. There are aspects that I touch on in relation to litigation and for regulatory investigation as well, because you may be dealing with engagement teams that are sending 150 emails a day just on one particular client. Within that, there will be documents that they wished after the event had not been written. So one of the things, it's about, I talk about this anterior cingulate cortex. It's about not letting yourself down, where you can actually, the professional work can be fine, but there are issues within the documentation that was sent late at night or in moments of anger. They may be internal memos between the teams. They may be communications with the client. They may be humorous, or at the time they were thought to be humorous. All of those sorts of things can be misconstrued after the event, and it's from the kind of pure perspective, outside of the kind of looking at the quality of the underlying work. From my perspective, and my role is to try and reduce the likelihood of those sorts of documents being in there in the first place, because they let people down.
Okay. All right, Stephen, I had a question for you. I'll take that one. Easier. During your presentation, you talked about reducing the likelihood of litigation and active listening. And I remember a quote where usually we listen to respond and not to understand. So in dealing with training, what are some of the things that you've implemented in order to ensure that we're actually listening to understand and not just to respond?
Training people to be empathetic is hard. I've experienced this where I did a mediation where the opposing side, the representative from the actual client concerned, didn't speak a word of English. And I could tell, when I was hearing the legal arguments from the other side's lawyer, as you were describing it, I was composing my rebuttal as the person was speaking. And during the course of the mediation, it became readily apparent that the person who didn't speak English had the upper hand, because they were looking at all the body cues that I was exhibiting, and sure enough, got me at the breaking point of what I was prepared to negotiate at. And I felt this quite strongly at the time, and then I put it into practice later. I went to Switzerland. I used to manage a team in Switzerland dealing with contentious matters there, and I didn't speak a word of Swiss German. And I was involved in a court process which is akin to a mediation. It's a sort of court-facilitated mediation process that they have over there. And not speaking a word of English gave me a huge advantage in that context, because I could see through the dilation of the people's pupils exactly when their breaking point was. So that's one of the ways I've put it. But in terms of training people, it's very hard to get people to just appreciate, to know themselves. I think Pascal says about the importance of knowing yourself. It's if you can get people to pose questions in relation to themselves, to understand themselves, and you kind of lead by example in terms of what your own limitations are, that goes some way. Doing it to large numbers of people is a challenge.
Exactly. And I was going to say also, when you were talking about the inappropriate emails, we've had situations where clients do not reply at all, just do not do it. And so a lot of times they would have things at the bottom, and normally people go all the way down to the beginning and they read up, and you're like, eh. So sometimes we've had to settle situations only because of the emails, like you said, they thought they were funny initially, and then if I'm on the other side, I don't think it's funny at all. So you have to be very, very careful with that. So are there any other questions from the audience? Okay.
I can tell, just going back to your previous comment, there was a funny study that was done on ethics, and the question, you've got a broader question as can you teach ethics? They looked at university libraries in the States and books that would only be taken out by ethicists, so people who are PhDs in ethics, and they compared the rates of theft for those books against every other book within the library, because on the basis was that if you were taught ethics, then would you become more ethical? And they actually found that these books were stolen more often.
That's funny. That says a lot. Okay. I would like to see your presentation now, so if we can try to get that going. I think we can see that, and then we can do the presentations as we've been doing.
in my job. It arises out of looking at the underlying causes of litigation, the decisions that were taken, and what could have made a difference. I am whispering because if we could fix these and make us litigation-proof, there wouldn't be a need for me. Analysis of the cause of claims shows there are moments that matter. Moments when our decisions and behaviors, as well as our work, can increase or reduce our exposure. I give you an example from one case. There will be questions at the end, so please watch carefully. The details have been changed to protect the innocent, including the name of the former client, a banker, who for this purpose we shall call Mr. Bounderby. He was a forceful personality and a demanding client. He cancelled meetings at short notice because he was buying a forest. He demanded a very personal service and also wanted to, and did, talk down our fees. He was a difficult client, but it would be a mistake to think Mr. Bounderby was the litigation type. His claim was utterly preventable. We ended up in litigation with Mr. Bounderby, and yet our formal written advice was 100% correct. It was our behavior in the margins that meant we got sued. But why? Well, there were two types of mistakes, one on each side of the brain. A, left brain mistakes, and B, right brain mistakes. Left brain mistakes are technical or analytical, a spreadsheet error, bad tax planning, or not following procedures. The right brain is about emotional expression and seeing the bigger picture. Right brain mistakes include a bad emotional response to a conflict, or not seeing the wood for the trees, or forest, in Mr. Bounderby's case. Our written advice to him was detailed, well considered, and fundamentally correct, but we provided it late, which upset him and led him to chisel away at our fees. We met Mr. Bounderby again several months later. It just so happened it was a few days after a change in the law, a law which had the potential to affect our earlier advice. Did we advise him on the change of law? Did we say, this is all very new and complicated and would depend on your circumstances, so please let us know if you'd like an update and we will look at the position? Did we not notice that the law change could even be relevant? We can't be sure. There were notes of the meeting, but nothing about updating our advice. Just one line in a note following up this meeting would have been a get-out-of-jail-free card and would have given better client service. We advised Mr. Bounderby that he should revert to us before taking action based on this advice to give us the opportunity to provide advice better tailored to his plans. We had 4 separate opportunities to clarify this was our position, but failed to take each one. The first opportunity was the day after the meeting when Mr. Bounderby emailed to say no need to follow up in writing, save costs. A response of simply, as discussed, please revert to us should you require an update to our advice would have given better client service. This was the first, but not the last time we did nothing. Mr. Bounderby sent 3 emails to the manager over the next few years, which told us of his changing circumstances. Little by little, he was edging towards the scope of the law change and emailing to say that he regarded our report as still relevant and wanted to ensure the contents were not lost in a dusty old file. We could have called Mr. Bounderby to see why he was sending these emails. We could have asked whether he wanted assistance and potentially new advice. But we did nothing. We took the path of least resistance. Why? Because it would have been a difficult conversation to have. One where he would have demanded to get the update for free. But putting your head in the sand is not good risk management. Spending time with your clients, even when it includes difficult conversations, is good risk management. Then Mr. Bounderby took certain steps without telling us and fell foul of the new legislation. As a result, he created a large liability, which he said was our fault. He then asked to see the engagement partner. At that meeting, the team felt ambushed and exposed. They met Mr. Bounderby's hostility with their own arrogance and aggression. They made off-the-cuff comments without checking the facts. They didn't seek to understand his complaint or empathize with his position. They simply sought to justify the work. They didn't escalate the matter despite threats of a claim in the meeting. Mr. Bounderby sent increasingly angry emails which were not appropriately addressed. The result? Mr. Bounderby sued, and for large amounts of money. When I looked at the file, it read like a slow-motion plane crash, with the black box discovered in the rubble recording a litany of left and right brain mistakes that led inevitably to a claim. Reflecting on this story, ask yourself some searching questions. Why did this client relationship fail? When and how should this client have been challenged? And what should the manager have kept a record of? Thank you for listening. See you again soon.
You don't have to answer these questions. That was for internal training purposes.
Very good, very good. Okay, are there any other questions? If not, we will end our session. Thank you so much for being attentive and staying. And I'll do the presentations now. Okay, I don't know if you want to say anything else. Or, okay, can you please stand, Virginia? Thank you. This is for you. Thank you very much. And Stephen, this one is for you. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Virginia, and Stephen. That was indeed a very nice presentation. So we are about to conclude our session, but before we do that, I would like to call on stage Mr. Azam Ghani, the Director of World Litigation Forum, just for his closing note.
Good evening, everyone. So it's been very encouraging 2 days. I thank everyone who are over here for their wonderful support, for making this till the end. I know it was tough, but yes, we made it. Thank you so much, and hope you have a wonderful stay in London. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Azam. So thank you, everyone, for staying till the end. We really appreciate your presence. And with this, we conclude our conference. Thank you so much once again, and we look forward to your presence again in our future events. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.